Yo, Americans be wildin'. And you know which ones I'm talking about. Alright, so let me tell you what I saw in the news. So basically, some guy in Virginia that was bragging about how he had fun at the Capital Riots was just sentenced 6 years in prison.
Lock that bitch up.
Smells like justice. This story is pretty wild, so just keep listening so you can hear what he thought he could get away with. Like, dummy. Why are you so stupid?
Why are you
stupid? Trump really did have those Americans feeling like they could do anything. Let's get to it. The guy's name is Markus Maly. So the lawyer going against him pointed out that Markus Maly was a lifelong criminal with 33 prior convictions on his record, including 2 for battery of a law enforcement officer. Marcus, you stupid. So Maly told Judge Amit Mehta, I feel like I'm fucking up all these words. Like, first of all, Marcus's name is probably Markus Maly, but I'm calling him Maly. Whatever, I don't care about this man and I don't care about the police. So I'm gonna just butcher these names, alright? So let's get it. Maly told U.S. District Judge Amit Mehta that he regrets traveling to Washington and following the mob of Donald Trump's supporters. Yeah, I bet you do now. Like, you go to jail now. The fuck? But he insisted that he merely occupied space in the crowd and denied attacking and pepper spraying police. How you think you're gonna get away with that? He says to the judge, I went to a rally, that's what I did. Obviously, you're caught on camera. This is what the judge said, yeah. It's not that you were there and occupying space. It's that you did these things and kept doing them that day. The prosecutors then said that Maly was one of the rioters who tried to profit off of them being at the riot by trying to let the public see them as patriots and heroes. This part blew my mind. I'm not sure if it's gonna shock you, but I was like, Maly raised over $16,500 through a donation page, and he referred to himself as a January 6th prisoner of war. That's mad money, like, damn. Normally I would be very jealous about this and I'd be like, damn, that's not right. Then white people really sent him that much money. But now that I know that he can only spend it on ramen noodle packs, like, it doesn't matter that much. He later joined the mob and attacked the police at the Capitol.
We all gonna fight. Everybody.
Maly sprayed a chemical at the police department officer, Christopher Boyle. And really, I don't give a fuck about these police. So once Christopher and all the other police officers who were trying to run away in the little tunnel, Maly passed a spray canister from one rioter to the other.
We all gonna fight.
This is what was said in court. So the lawyer was like, gotcha, bitch. This is what Maly claimed. Yeah, listen to this. He was explaining that the stream of liquid coming out of the canister was actually a piece of fringe on his hat. A fringe?
Not the banging.
So however, his hat did not have a fringe. There's evidence. And you still lying like that? Wow. Defense attorney Benjamin Schiffelbein. Yo, these names. Schiffelbein said Maly believed that the 2020 presidential election was stolen from Trump. He believed that he was protesting in the name of liberty and freedom. His motives, however wrong they may have been, were based in values this country celebrates. Shut the f*** up. Drop a bald eagle in the comments if you feel like justice was served. Period. Oh, and like and follow for more.